Nick Makoha was born in Uganda and fled the Idi Amin dictatorship with his mother. He has lived in Kenya, Saudi Arabia, and currently resides in London. Nick's first poetry book, Kingdom of Gravity, was published in 2017 and shortlisted for the Felix Dennis Prize for Best First Collection and the Forward Prize for Best First Collection. Carol Rumans reviewed it in Poetry Review, and she said, "The London-based Ugandan Nick Makoha writes with a specific aim to anatomize the tyranny of the Idi Amin dictatorship. As he reveals the horrific local and individual effects of the mass murderous regime, he transforms the brute weight of propaganda through his linguistic art. Located narrative, rich detail and characterization combine with the subtly handled devices of oral poetry, repetition, rhyme, refrain, synchronicity. To call the book powerful would be to risk the sort of cliche Makoha scrupulously avoids. What matters is the double thrust of the collection's power. Neither aesthetics nor ethics are dictatorial. Both are guardians of its gravity." Nick's previous pamphlets are The Lost Collection of an Invisible Man, The Second Republic, and Resurrection Man, which won the Toy Derricott and Cornelius Eady Chapbook Prize 2016 in America. He was also joint winner of the 2015 Brunel International African Poetry Prize. Nick wrote and performed his one-man show, My Father and Other Superheroes, from 2013 internationally. He is widely anthologized, including sitting on the fatherhood panel at the inaugural Being a Man Festival and the Bringing Up Boys panel at the Women of the World Festival, both at London's South Bank. Makoha is also a Complete Works alumni, a national development program for Black and Asian poets. His mentor, the poet George Surtees, said of Nick's poetry, "There is in Makoha's work an intriguing balance between the immediate and the stately that fits his material and offers possibilities for expansion and further exploration. All that, his personal history, the history of his country, and the leaving of it, suggests to me a talent at the beginning of a genuinely important road." Will you please welcome Nick Makoha?
I tell you, it's really embarrassing hearing somebody speak very highly of you. And last year was quite overwhelming for me because a lot of people I respect and admire said very nice things about my poetry. And it's weird sometimes when you're sitting in your, well, when I say my office, I mean my dining table. But when you're sitting at your dining table and you're trying to conjure up a book that you would be proud of, it's strange when you hear people saying things that you've only thought of in your head. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So I'm going to share with you this book, Kingdom of Gravity. I'm going to read a few sections. I'll read the title poem. I'll read some of my favorite poems. I'll read the last poem that went into the book, which literally went in 4 days before it was supposed to be printed. And I'll share with you some of my musings. So there's a postcard for anyone who buys the book. I know some people just bought the book, but I have some postcards that you can get. And on that postcard, it has a poem called King of Myth. And I will start with that poem. Back when you were taken from our lives, like the Son of God, ascending into heaven, at the barricade to another life, policemen on their motorbikes named you King of Myth. You danced to tossed grenades, all part of the charade in their fire ritual. In a restless air, we surrendered our weapons, axe heads, shanks, short rope, blades, some poison, and all its animal understanding, now fair game to the enemy with our world in their scope. they came down hills. During the blackout, phantoms from a fallen sky. With years of practice at soft landings onto rooftops in darkness, like a spirit slipping into skin. The voice of their guns kept the violence from escaping. A disturbance in the trees can easily be mistaken for wind. Honey, I'm still free. Take a chance on me, as the radio sings. So I want to share with you, initially this book would never, there are several reasons why this book is in existence. So one, I think you've heard a lot of writers talk about shame, and I didn't think I had permission to write about my home country for two reasons. One, I wasn't living in my home country. Two, I was no longer speaking the languages of my home country. Three, I felt like many of the things were not my memories to share. So it took a lot of, I guess, courage or getting over your shame to write this. But one of the early poems that helped me realize that I could was a memory I had, and that memory is encapsulated in this poem called Stone. The best thing I did was move my body from one side of the world to another. Now, this required a visa, which required a bribe placed in the palm of a man with a gun. Took my mother's monthly wage packet. The man with the gun let you speak to a clerk. Now, he too wanted his wage, because it would be his job to have words with the judge for another month's salary. The official wanted his bribe, so he listened to the clerk, escorted by the soldier as he held his gun. As I sat with my mother at the steps of a court drinking soda, waiting for one man to say yes, my mother said, "In Uganda, a bribe stops men from doing nothing. It rolls away the stone." Her sips were slower than mine, each separated by this prayer. So I left the country when I was 4 years old. But since then, since really all of my childhood, I was always traveling on planes. And a lot of times, I was traveling alone. So my mom brought me to England, but I spent a lot of times in Kenya and Saudi Arabia. And oftentimes, I'd be traveling by myself with no other companion. So in this collection, I have what I call terminal poems. So I'm going to read you two of them, if that's okay. So the first one is called MBA, which is the flight code for Mombasa Airport. Minutes after the Airbus took off, a German girl in first class starts talking about the afterlife and things that belong to the dead. One man swallows duty-free rum to replace the taste of sugarcane, his skin hissing and splitting like a fuse as the sun glides in reverse. He is mastering the art of being a persistent illusion. Here is mine. The world is connected by a circle. The same circle a man might make folding his arms around another man's shoulder. Light bends through the cabin. At the edge of my window, small towns pass. Clouds cascade and dance. We are both holding our breath, reciting the laws of probability. My eyes are closed. I call it the garden of the blind. I am back in the old world where light bends through the clouds. The soldier by the kiosk loves the taste of his words. Women jostle for provisions. Their children wade ankle deep in water. Their reflections dance across the surface. 2 continents away, a cameraman lifts his hand for silence. In the oil refinery that looks bigger than he imagined, 2 men walk in the dark. The camera lens searching for a quality of lost light. They are moving by memory of a stolen blueprint tattooed to their minds. I have the same tattoo. So one of the things I realized, I mean, we were talking about gender and all these things. One of the things I've been looking at when I was writing this book is the value of the black body. Now, what is the value of the black body? And it's strange to think, just as they were talking yesterday about women are still not being paid equally, still the value of the black body is below its right currency, So there was this poem that kept coming to me, and I realized that a lot of times when I write listening to music, and sometimes it will be an instrumental, sometimes I'll be just playing a song on repeat. So the song I was listening to when I was writing this poem was a song by D'Angelo on his new album. And I'm actually taking my wife to go see that in a few weeks' time, so I'm kind of excited. So, but yeah, the poem is called Black Death. And one of the things I realized is Uganda is a paradise. It's a beautiful part of the world. And you start to realize why countries like mine become colonized, because if you pass through it, you're not going to want to leave. But the consequence of colonialism and other factors means that many paradises are turned into kind of living hells. And this poem looks at that through the devaluation of the black body. Black Death. Two men who have never had a country of their own fall out over a girl in a bar. In place of war, they pull off their shirts, lunatics in an embrace, as a barmaid fills my glass with local ale. Policemen hang out of armed cars with sophisticated weapons. Fleas fry on their backs as a ricochet gives voice to the air. At full stretch, a camera blinks at an unshaven male, clearly dead. They are beating his body, while I stand outside myself. A year from now, I will suffer the same death by water. This body will be a map in the dark, moving towards a shore. By the open stove of my wife's village, there will be death by surprise, death by marriage, death by having rummaged into a distant past of a man that neither of us remembers. After the boycott marches, there will be death by placards. In radio silence, Israeli ground troops will storm a home looking for the archbishop. Death by Judas kiss. Lizard-colored helicopters will filled with embassy men, and snipers with walkie-talkies will signal for death by long shot. Demonstrators behind masks with eyes like loaded dice will ask for death by decay. The body turning black, bloodlet like a pig. The crowd is here, offering false compliment to an immigrant on his knees. Death by confession, words that are not your own. A note whispered in the earshot of a New York Times news crew as a man sets fire to himself. The body, now an animal, bent double, a shadow of vague form, promising to rise itself from the earth. Sorry, these are not joyous poems. I will try and find you the happiest poem in the book. But what I realized is it was Pascal Petit who kind of reminded me that sometimes you have to look at hard things. And I've been leading some workshops here in Berlin, and one of the things that came up, somebody said, "Why do you make it sound beautiful?" And I think I was in a workshop with Kwame Dawes, and he says there is a grace in many. Beauty is not always the things that we like. It's sometimes in the things that we don't like. So death is a beautiful thing. When you see a body being released, it is a beautiful thing, but it is not beautiful to experience, But when you put the two together, something comes out of that. So. Yeah. So what I'm going to do, actually, I'll move from that poem, the happy poem. I'm going to give it to you in a minute. But what I will do is I just want to tell you the story of the last poem that went in the book. It's probably my favorite poem because it took me about 6 years to write. So sometimes you have an idea and nothing works. So what I wanted to write was about, there's a famous archbishop that was killed. And recently, I've just been out with my director. We're doing a play based on my mom smuggled me out of Uganda. It's called The Dark. And so we went on a tour. It wasn't really like a safari tour. It was more of a tour of the Idi Amin regime. And we actually saw the place where the archbishop was possibly, well, he was definitely murdered. And his murder was then portrayed in a very strange way. So I'm going to share that with you right now. But the only thing I want you to do for me is that I just want you to remember the bird. Can somebody just tell me what I just said? All right, cool. Remember the bird. All right, good. You guys are listening. I'm just checking. You're laughing now. So, okay, you better laugh now because there's nothing to laugh at later. But, all right, bird in flames. A man and his beer talks to another man after a swig of a bottle. He leaks out a, In the first death, I am a bird, darting from an oncoming pickup truck under starlight. As I head for the grass, a static quiet. The pickup drives down the road. 2 men mention genocide. A third struggles to confess that he has spoken to the tribes and it stirred conflict. Earlier, the third man was blindfolded, a hand resting at the bottleneck of his throat, a knife at his wrists. Others surrounded him. In a circle under a low purple light, discomfort dripped from his mouth. They were looking for a reaction. The moment was disguised as a get-together, hence the beer and chapatis and women's voices outside rising over music. The third man's arms are crossed as a deep voice enters the discussion and asks him, "Truthfully, Bishop, where are the arms?" The night has an Indian heat. Silence glues the third man to his seat. The voice has set a table. He leans into the bishop's ear, rolls his sleeve, and invites him to join him once he has told him where the guns are. The guns. The guns. The bishop replies, "I can live without your formality, without these courtesies. What meal have you prepared that I have not eaten?" The voice kicks his chair out from under him. Back in the pickup truck, bodies are not moving, no side glances. They pass a school, a settlement, a store, a trading post, past the hills, but there is no conversation. Now notice the bird. The car's headlights are like fireflies. Since the moments has passed, I can tell you there was no bird. But the men were real, and the table full of food. The only thing missing are the bullets, a second death. That is how nations die over there. And when I say nation, I mean tribe. And when I say tribe, I mean people. And when I say over there, I mean here. So I was having a good conversation just outside, and one of the things I realized is that we assume that we live in democracy. And democracy is when the citizens have permission to participate in their society. And one of the things, the signs of a democracy or the illusion of democracy eroding is when a city vanishes. And so this poem is called How a City Vanishes. All it takes is two men on a bike, a convoy, in their rearview mirror, some land, a shortage of visas, the closing of embassies, a night lowering the curtain of curfew, some C4 to turn a dirt highway into a makeshift airstrip. Out come the men in uniform, following the flare of a flashlight towards life lurking in the long grass. White soldiers with foreign words that taste too much like caution, huddled around a wireless, waiting for orders, keeping their voices down. A war reporter, tourist and volunteer, with the same faces, just cleared the checkpoint, said they were on safari, hence the cameras. Tonight, they will make the weekend edition of The People. Tomorrow, our city, or some version of it, will be as familiar as the dark side of the moon. So I wrote a sequence of these. I wrote 3 of them, and I'll read a second one from that sequence of how to. So I kind of got the idea from the idea of a manual. Yeah, so you have those how-to manuals. So we've got how to paint a wall, how to make blood, how a city vanishes, and this one is how to paint a wall. 3 things feel useful to me: my father's voice, the flame of it, black smoke rising from a fallen sun, the last slow breath saw one body drag another up the streets looking for smokes in the breast pockets of the dead. I have the wallet, but no lighter. I know his face, but after 10 minutes of watching this sleep, you can count yourself lucky that you can say your name out loud and that you are not him wrapped around bone, like old muscle on the street outside. Without the stool, there is no king, no throne. Tribesmen worship clumps of human hair. The creek we used to leap from barefoot into a pan where the body was like a yolk and it would split. Roads now turn into snakes. This is what passes for nightlife. After curfew, stealing your fingers across a woman's thigh means, why not? On the radio, a translator uses static silence to describe paramilitaries lining up newsmen for execution. Headshot, close, dried like vermilion blood, like Rorschach blocks tattooed to the wall of a millet factory. Blame the Inspector General, those with locomotive eyes, who did it for God and country. So this book initially, when I was writing it, and I think Bernadine saw some of the early poems, it was initially called The Second Republic. And that's what Idi Amin would have called Uganda if he had been able to implement the kind of government he wanted to establish. But unbeknownst to me, you cannot call your pamphlet the same thing as your first collection. So I kind of had to change that. And then the title poem kind of emerged. And I was on a writing retreat in America called Cave Canem, which is a writing retreat for black writers of color. And I remember the night that I wrote the poem, and it kind of trickled out with the first word. So I'd really like to share with you that poem. And it's probably one of the poems in the book that has, even though there's kind of melancholy to it, it has a kind of hope. Kingdom of Gravity, I'll share that with you. How much time do I have left, Bernie? A couple more? Okay, thank you. Kingdom of Gravity. We are not Alexander, who conquered worlds, giving them new tongues, but we share the story of a ship resting on an African river, unbuckling at its shore, awakened by a night's cold, hard rain, staring at the face of the Nile as it reminds you, you are a hawk, silent in the voice of a midnight universe. What makes a man name a city after himself? Asking bricks to be bones, asking the wind to breathe like the lungs of a night, asking the night to come closer to speak to you as a tribe, asking sleep to loosen language, asking language to dream. Come close to me. Can you not see that I'm in search of fire? The unshapen song of light? In my mouth is a name, hovering like smoke, spoken to me by the oracle. Like others, I was in search of a forest, a place to call home. But what can I tell you about the kingdom? About having the world at your feet? When you have seen all of earth's boundaries, you will crave for them in mirrors. You will search for them in streams. And when the river looks back at you, how can you be sure that nothing is lost? Damn, this is scary. I don't know if it's me. If I was you, I'd be scared, as I say. But I think it's just your listening ear is very attentive, and I'm aware. I think I'll share this with you. When I was writing, when I first got the first copy of this book, because I'd just come back from America, and there was this big box at the front of the house, and it had my name on it, and I didn't even realize it was my book. And then I opened it. It was a bunch of the books sent from the publisher, and I read it, and I cried, because you only see your book as an A4 manuscript. To see it as an artifact, as a piece of something was amazing. So I'm just going to read you two more poems, and if I haven't said thank you to the British Council, thank you. If I haven't said thank you to Bernadine for having me here, thank you. And you guys are a really good crowd. You guys stayed the whole day, just focus. You know? And like when we ask questions, you like about 10 hands come up. You guys are good. But anyway, so yeah. So one of the obvious tropes of Africa and wars and stuff like that is the boy soldier. And so I wanted to look at that, and I did so in this poem called Killing Craft. Boy in army fatigues has his palm on a gun. Boy smokes ganja, said it makes him run. Boy with the same name as me from the same clan. Boy killed his father and buried him in the sand. Boy leads battalion but can't spell his name. Boy has river of AIDS running through his veins. Boy sleeps with 12 virgins to make him disappear. Bet your boy will be Abraham by the end of the year. Boy thinks he's Chuck Norris, thinks he's Bruce Lee. Boy learned Krav Maga in training camp led by Israelis. Boy uses freight trains to disguise his advance from behind. Boy asks Aisha for a dance. Boy back teeth as sharp as bayonets, sucks on her breasts with war gin breath. Boy knows his bride price will fall. She spread eagle with her back up off the wall. Boy eyes are a moon white stare. Inside her body he goes off like a flare. Look down the street, his troop in a jeep gives the bird, it's time to retreat. Okay, I'll just read one more poem and then go join Bernadine. So I'll read you another, what I call the terminal poems, which is me in airports. So my experience is usually kind of myself sat like Bernadine in an airport waiting either for my mother, father, uncle, whoever had to pick me up. So these poems are kind of musings on those times. So I'll read you, and they kind of open up each chapter. So I'll read you one, and then I'll go and join Bernadine. So this one's called JED, which is the airport code for Jeddah International Airport. I am sitting at Terminal 2 Customs in King Abdulaziz International Airport, my Ugandan passport in my top left breast pocket, holding on to an unopened mint condition Jetfire transformer that my mom bought me in East Street Market, my only companion as I wait for my dad. Through the heat-proof glass, I can see white Muslims gathered for the Hajj. At the pilgrim's terminal's tent, shaped with Teflon-coated skin. Jetfire says, it reminds him of Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. I can't see Moses. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. It was wonderful to hear you read your work. So your childhood was shaped by leaving Uganda as a small child. So you were separated from your homeland, and then you were separated also from your father because your parents separated. So that somehow, obviously, was with the two sort of important things that I would imagine that happened to you as a child, which has in turn shaped this poetry collection all these years later, something like 40 years later maybe. Yeah. So can you talk to us about that, about what it was like growing up, feeling separated from the two things that were so important to you, and then the process of writing this book?
Yeah, definitely. I only because I've recently just finished my MA, I think these events were the catalyst for me becoming a writer. Because having been separated, as you said, from my country, my father, my language, poetry became my language. And I learnt on it hard. I didn't realize that I was always writing. Like I said to you, what I remember was, what I'm aware of is that I suffer from, I don't know if I still suffer from it, but when I was a child, I suffered from separation anxiety. The sense of always thinking, I never lived in a place more than 3 years at a time. So after 3 years, I'd always be in another country. And it got to the point where I literally had a case, and it would have my most important things. So when that kid talks about Jetfire, that was the most important thing because that was the last thing that my mother gave me. So what I'm aware of is, and I guess that was my shame. And that's probably why I didn't write. It took me so long to write about it, because no one wants to admit that, well, I don't know if it's no one, but I as a man did not want to admit my shame, didn't want to admit I wasn't engaged with my language. Because when I go home, I'm not Ugandan enough. When I'm in England, I'm not English enough, and then...
So what was the shame as you were growing up?
I'd just like to be, I guess, more integrated into my Ugandanness, I guess. When you're young and you're growing up in England and you're seeing the Afro-Caribbean community and their identity is richly expressed, whereas yours isn't. Like, it's only now that I can recognize East Africans. Back then you couldn't. We were few and far between. And so I always felt like this other, this outsider, and you always felt like you had to kind of fit in. And I always wanted, like for my children, this London is theirs. They belong to London. They don't have to pretend to be from London. They are from London. Whereas I always felt that whenever I was in a country, I was trying to assimilate, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So then what was the process of writing this book eventually?
I think you have to be honest with yourself. I think, you've heard the novelists speak, and they spoke about, you write from your authentic space. That was mine. When I first started performing poetry, because that's how it started outwardly. I was writing in my house and at home, When I started performing poetry, I was just writing kind of contemporary stuff. But I went to a workshop with Roger Robinson, and my cousin had recently died in Kenya of a sickle cell attack. They had tried to revive him, and he'd come out of the coma, then he fell back into the coma. Then they tried to revive him again, and he fell back into the coma, and he didn't return. And I had to go to the funeral. And at that same time, my friend lost her sister. She was one of the first people to die from deep vein thrombosis in a plane. So these two people had just died, and I flew over with my mom for my cousin's funeral. We got the body from Kenya. We escorted the body back to Uganda and buried it. And then I came back for my friend's funeral, and at my friend's funeral I was crying, but I wasn't crying for the loss of her sister. I was crying for the loss of my cousin. And as I walked into Roger's workshop with Apples and Snakes, I was the only person who attended the workshop. And I showed him some of my work, and he's like, don't like any of this work. But then this had just happened, and he says, so tell me about yourself. So I started telling him, and he said, well, read me that poem. And I think it's in that book over there, The Lost Collection of Invisible Man. And that was my first kind of like coming out as a Ugandan in the poetry in the poetry sense.
So when you said you were writing contemporary poetry, you meant you weren't writing anything rooted in your culture?
No, it wasn't rooted in my culture. And I don't think I wasn't consciously doing that on purpose, but I was aware. It was only when I wrote that poem I suddenly became aware, wow, I've never written anything about Uganda. Why is that?
Why was that?
I didn't think I had permission. I think it took me, even when I wanted to write this book, it took me about a year, maybe 2 years, to give myself permission to start writing the poems, because I didn't feel like I was a true Ugandan. You know, like, so if I say I'm Ugandan to a Ugandan, they say, so what tribe are you from? I know the tribe. So what language do you speak? I know the language. Can you speak the language? No. And at that point, my Ugandan license falls to the floor and explodes. And I think it's a stupid shame, but it was a shame that was inside me, and it was enough to stop me from wanting to even look at myself or even write about my experience.
Was it also because you fled Idi Amin's regime? So in looking at that, because you would probably be looking at that history,
yes,
which is, you know, it was a brutal regime, it was a dictatorship,
yeah,
and that you would have to re-engage or engage with that as an adult, the reality of what happened, because you weren't reading so many of those poems, but a lot of the books in the collection do express the brutality of his regime.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, it was, I think, actually, I was scared to write about the gruesome nature of the regime, and also have to look at it like, in the research, when you dig below the commonly known stories of that regime, it's horrific. And even like I said, when we went back with my director recently, we had that tour. I mean, some of the things that we found out, it's just, it's inhumane, you know. So, and that's not what you want to write about. You don't want to write about the most horrible things, you know.
And also, there's also an issue, so certainly in the UK, perhaps in Europe, that there is a certain version of Africa, and you touched on this earlier today. There's a certain version of Africa which is about brutalized children, about civil war, child soldiers, the terrible things that have happened on the continent, although they happen everywhere else as well. But there is a particular narrative that has made the media and is in the sort of national imaginary, if you like, in the UK. So you, through exploring your personal history, you're also connecting to that, you know, the way in which Africa and Uganda is represented.
Yeah.
So what were there issues with that as you were writing it?
Yeah, I mean, I was very conscious that I didn't want to just write into that kind of, those cliches and those tropes. So what I wanted to do is that, you know, what makes any piece of art interesting is the human connection. And so the thing I was struggling, not just with my shame on one side, I had to improve my craft as well, but also the next layer to that was then, how do you make work connect? Because in the West, which we are in, this is not a story that people are I must know about Uganda. What's going on in Uganda? You know, the only time its name comes up is if you're talking about, you know, what's recently happened, you know, with homophobia, or if it's Idi Amin. Those are the only, and they're not positive spins. So I was like, how do I bring a relatively modern story to a society that's not really interested in that story? And even when they are interested, they have a very cliched version, or that just sits into tropes. So that was what I spent almost a year, 2 years just researching, trying to figure out, okay, what is the real story? Because if I'm not going to be cliche, how do I find out the real story? Okay, now I found out the real story. How do I tell that to ears that don't necessarily want to listen to what I have to say?
But it's also then accepting that your readership is a Western readership. It's not a Ugandan readership.
Yeah.
So you were aware of that?
Very aware.
You know, you weren't writing for a Ugandan readership. And I think that's one of the issues with African writers, especially those in the diaspora, that they're so aware that they have to engage and enroll a readership that is not from their culture.
I was aware of that, but also at the same time, I mean, luckily for me, when I did my book launch, I had 2 book launches. So I had one in London and one in Uganda. And probably my proudest moment was that when I read it to in Uganda, they got the book, and it's almost like it was good, you know. So I was very aware I was writing into a Western listening, but the other thing I wanted to do for myself was to make it, you know, good enough for a native Ugandan to read and say, yeah, that works for me. You know?
Also, it explores an extreme version of masculinity, the worst kind of masculinity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's men at war and the terrible things that men do at war. But it's also exploring fatherhood,
Yes.
you know. So it's in fact the actual words men and boys appear in a lot of your poems. It's a very male book. This is not a criticism.
I don't take it as such.
No, because I'm saying that is simply what you're exploring. But it's also the extremes of that. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, I mean, I hope what you've seen in the book is, even though we're in war, men are in vulnerable positions, or in positions that compromise their character. So, you know, so I read you that poem, Black Death. It's about a man seeing a death and then realizing that he's going to be dead in a year, more likely, and many people, just because of his death, are going to die. That is a very vulnerable space to be in when you think, you know, in my life, I never think about death. I don't have, in the West, I do not have to think about death. I only have to think about death if I listen to the news. And when I listen to the news, it's just a gaze. It's just a gaze on a world. So what I was aware of when looking at the male gaze, particularly in Uganda, was like, how do I start talking about things that are more, that show the quality of how fragile the quality of men's lives can be in the vice of war. Yeah.
You're also, okay, how many Ugandan poets are there, contemporary poets who are publishing collections?
1.
Exactly. This is it, right? Nick is it. So there's also that you're the only person at the moment, as far as we know, publishing a contemporary poetry book from Uganda.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that because so one of our famous poets from Uganda is Akot Bitek. I think his daughter also writes. She's you know. But apart from that, it's just, he's dead now, but apart from that, it's myself. And when I was trying to do the research to find more Ugandan literature that I could draw on, so I didn't want to go straight to the history books or to the papers. I also wanted to look at, so what literature is there about this time? It was few and far between, and even that was a pressure. I was like, oh, so now I'm going to be the guy. So I had this kind of pressure on myself that was like, if I got it wrong, you know, it's a silly pressure, but I'm just being honest with you, you know, so.
In a sense, this is the book you had to write, isn't it?
I had to write it, yeah, that was, thank you, my coach. But yeah, so yeah, I had to write it, and I knew that at some point, when you face it, I had to write it. Like if I avoided it, it would always come back to haunt me. You know, it was that kind of feeling.
And your father features in it a little bit. So what's your I mean, if you want to say, what's your relationship with your father now? Or how has he responded to the book? Because he and your mother, because they lived through it as adults.
Mm-hmm. Well, my mom has, the first time, she's very proud of the book. She came to, because it was shortlisted for the Ford, so she came to the Ford Prize ceremony, and she probably gave me the best comment I've ever heard from my mom. And she said, how do you know all these things? Which means that it was accurate according to her recollection. And that meant a lot to me. My father, my relationship with him, I have a good relationship with my father. I think, you know, for several reasons. One is I'm a father now, so I understand the intricacies of fatherhood. But also, you know, you got to understand that, you know, if the Idi Amin regime didn't happen, when you think about this, all our presidents have not been duly elected. They've just stepped into their role. So we've never had an elected leader. So, you know, if the war hadn't happened, if the regime hadn't happened, I probably would not be a British citizen right now. I would be a Ugandan citizen. And so I'm aware that some of the things that tore my family apart I cannot rest them on the shoulders of my father, you know.
Okay, and there's another question I want to ask, which is about, and it may sound really reductive, but it's about black male masculinity.
Yes.
Because we've been talking about masculinity, and you're a straight guy, but you're an African man, you're a Ugandan man, you're a black British man. And there are so many things that we don't discuss that are specific to somebody who comes from that demographic. Would you like to, I don't know, maybe it's too open a question, but would you like to talk a bit to what the considerations are as a writer when you're exploring masculinity as a black man?
Yeah, I mean, you might hear, it's hard to admit that being a male and black is not easy because there's so many judgments that people have. So Inouye Adams has a very good quote that he did for his play Barbershop Chronicles. He says, I only became a black African when I left Nigeria and came to England. Before that, he was just a man, you know. And so wherever I go, my color is talking for me, and it is deciding whether people will like me or not like me, will give me opportunity or not give me opportunity. And so what you have inside of that, there's a way that black families are. So for example, when we come out, you'll have the joke that goes, your parents want you to be a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. But what that really means is they want you to sustain economic strength, because that is a job that will give you money, that will secure your family, you know, because you're living in a system where you are the minority, when in reality there are more people of color around the world than there are people, Caucasians. But you're made to feel, I'm made to feel inferior when I step into the country. I'm made to feel inferior because of my color. And then I'm told to be the head of my household. There's too much juxtaposition. And so what you have it's very easy for a black family to erode because there is no outward context supporting its existence. And so when, you know, you heard it before, the word code switching, you know, I'm very aware of how I'm constantly being perceived as a black man walking through space. I'm aware, you know, I hate to say this, but, you know, there are only, I think, 3 black men in this room.
I think it's one more, isn't it?
There's, you know?
Yeah.
There's one, I know I spoke to one, the other one's, I think, the cameraman, and the other one's holding the mic. No, so whether I say that jokingly, and you're a warm crowd, but I'm a minority. You know, I walk into rooms. When I was writing this book, I'd go to workshops. And they say, who is the black man? The black man was me. I'd go into meetings. Who's the black man? The black man is me. And so unless you know people, and here's the other thing, I'm always perceived as a threat. So I have to diffuse the situation. But it never assumes that I might feel threatened. I'm always the threat. You know, so you can see how that can play out in a black household where you're thinking, how come that couple isn't getting on? He goes outside and he's the threat. He also has to provide, but he's not getting the opportunities. He comes home to his family, and his wife asks, so what have you been doing? It just creates problems upon problems. And I think it's a lot more complex, so we could go into the tropes, but there's a lot that I hope I'm giving you a glimpse of how volatile the situation can be,
I think, in the UK, a couple of books have come out in the last year. One's called British by Efua Hirsch,
yes,
which is about race and identity. And the other one is by Rennie Edo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Both of them, I've reviewed both of these books. One of them's due to come out. And both of them are annoyed that about white people who say they don't see race. And they don't see where racism, they don't accept that Britain is a racist society. And I think that's...
Are you going to ask me a question about this?
No, I'm just making a comment, because, I agree with them. So here we have a black male poet, if we're going to label you in that way, black male poet who's talking about how it is to walk through this world with all those stereotypes and assumptions that are heaped upon you. And people who don't understand that are people who are not you. Yeah, and it's different for me because I'm mixed race and I'm lighter. So, there are sort of the way in which shadism works, different people of colour are treated differently. So, I find it quite moving, actually, when you're talking about that.
Well, there are two things. I mean, I interviewed Kai Miller, and he says he doesn't experience racism because he grew up in the Caribbean, where he was a middle-class, Jamaican, and everyone was his colour. Didn't experience it. So I understand there are pockets of the world where you don't
but he doesn't experience it in the West.
So even when he comes here or in the West, what might be coming across as racism, it kind of just bounces off him. Ding, whatever. Yeah? But what I would say is that when you look at the bigger picture, is that you've got to understand that and this is not to point blame, it's just to point accuracy. The world as we know it, what we consider to be the West, is built off of regimes that encouraged racism. Yeah, colonialization, the taking over of someone's country. If we had a people come in right now and say, right, we're taking London, we're taking Germany, it's ours, nobody, we'd be like, whoa, who are you? Get out. But that's what's happened to a bunch of people. And then now they have no economic power, they have no decision-making at any of the... we don't when it comes to trade deals, we have no conversation. When it comes to currency, we have no conversation. So then, and this has gone on year after year. So not just a few years, it's like hundreds of years. So you have a position now where people of color are being born in the West, and they have no real say in the conversation, unless they're the one or two who are pushing through. And so why you get frustrated with that is that until people realize that the whole system is built. This is how you can say institutional racism. The whole system is built upon a way of thinking that, ostracizes certain people of color or certain people of different shades or women, or people of different gender. And until you can acknowledge that and say, right, then we need to change it. And so you don't have to worry about it when it doesn't affect you. That's how you can be blind to it. You can be myopic. You can say, it doesn't bother me, so it doesn't exist.
So the sort of some of your peers are also exploring issues to do with masculinity, I would say. So Kayo Chingonyi, who's Zambian British, and Roger Robinson, who's Trinidadian British, and Jacob Sam LaRose. So, you are people, less than a handful of you, who are exploring black male masculinity in Britain through your poetry.
Yes.
And it's very important. Yeah. And it makes your writing very political.
Yeah, what I realized, I didn't want, this book was no way to be political. I was just trying to tell the story of Uganda. But what I realized is the politics will rise up. If you tell any story authentically, the politics will rise up. As we saw yesterday when we were talking about the underclass, the politics of that just rose up. When, Gina was talking about gender, it rose up. When we're talking about sex, it rose up. So whenever you take anything seriously on, the politics of the situation rises up.
What about, can you just, before we move over to the audience, what about your play, My Father and Other Superheroes?
Right.
Do you want to tell people what that was about and how it
panned out?
Yeah, so well, I'm a poet through and through, but a few years ago I was asked to be part of a theatre company where we would just meet, kind of like a space like this, and just play. And we were asked to come up with ideas. So an idea that came to me was we had to come up with titles. So I came up with this title, My Father and Other Superheroes, and how it came about. I used to sit with the artistic director at Stratford Theatre Royal, and I would tell them stories about my childhood, and they would literally be in stitches. I was like, that never happened. I said, it did. And then, who was that? My dad. I said, why did your dad keep coming up? So it's like, you said, your dad's this kind of superhero that you never saw. So that's how I got the title, My Father and Other Superheroes, and it was pretty much about me learning at the birth of my child that, what I realized I didn't know what it was to be a father. Because I didn't live with my father, so all my notions of fatherhood were based on fictitious characters like Superman, I mean, you can't say it now, but the Cosby Show, stuff like that, But so all these notions were romantic notions, if you will, of fatherhood, and they're totally different from the actual version of fatherhood. And I had to pretty much learn how to be a father, but also to forgive my father for not being able to be the father that I had in my head, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We're going to open out. Do we have some questions? Yeah, Cortina.
I was 4 when I left. Things I remember are just fragments, and and then usually just relationships, like my relationship with my father, my stepmother at the time, and yeah, I do need to record it for many reasons. I remember my daughter once asked me, "Daddy, where am I from?" And I can't give her the language, but I can give her the story. And, so I thought, that's one of the reasons I had to kind of write about it. And as Bernadine pointed out, there's no one else who's written poetry about Uganda or about the Idi Amin regime. And that astounded me. Even that was crazy. Whereas, if I look to other literatures, other canons, the story of who they are exists. And that's one of the damaging things of that particular war, but also just of colonialization and other things that destroy communities. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's recorded.
Hi. It's a two-part question. I think the first one is, I think Bernadine asked you earlier about the idea of the shame. And do you think there is any power in owning that shame and actually empowering other diasporan Africans who, for whatever reason, feel shame because perhaps they don't have the language or they don't have, in some cases, the food or the culture? understanding that and speaking or empowering them through what you went through, because it's a genuine shame that a lot of diaspora, not just African, I guess, but in your case specifically, because there's a huge part of them feeling like identity and culture is such an inherent part of who they want to be, but because they don't have the language or those kind of things, they feel ashamed. So is there any way in which, through your work, you explore that aspect of the shame and actually owning that and actually empowering yourself through understanding that you could still be fully Ugandan without having that or whatever else? That's the first part of the question. Second part, okay.
I definitely think you should own the shame in that sense. But what I realize is that my shame is just a small version of a bigger condition. So when you go back to particularly Uganda, there was a collective trauma caused by the Idi Amin regime. And so I realized that my silence isn't just me being silent. It's people in Uganda do not talk about this period of history. It's kind of, it just floats there. They know about it, but it's not talked about. And a lot of the people of that part of history were killed. And so what you have is a younger demographic who now have hearsay and old stories of that period of time. So what I was aware of with my shame is that my shame was not helping the situation. It was adding to my complaint with this. How come there's no stories about my people? Well, they're not writing about it. Well, we're the writers. You're the writer. Oh, boo. So, that's kind of how I had to deal with it. I had to take my personal responsibility. So I think it is important to look at our shame for its different reasons and to notice that shame is a crippler. I don't think we should own it. I think it's the other way around. We should share it. I'm sharing it with you. I'm admitting to you I was embarrassed to write about it, but owning up to that embarrassment got me to write the book rather than just kind of holding it into my chest.
Yes, thank you. The second question is about the nuance of black masculinity and how, one, do you think there is enough representation of a spectrum of what that is? Because I think over the past, from the entertainment and kind of media representation of black masculinity has always been very one-dimensional. So do you feel like in the past, 2-3 years, or however recent, that there is enough counter representation of that, and do you feel like you are also in the position to also add to that kind of redressing of the spectrum of what black masculinity is, especially in the spaces that you said you exist in, being the minority in the majority of those spaces?
I'm wary of the word representation in the sense, I think in the media there's not enough representation of just good males in general. I think men get, as can be seen, you don't need my proof, but as can be seen in the media, men get away with a lot of things. Men of power get away with a lot of things. I mean, it's almost every other day I'm hearing in the news some American politicians being fired for some stupid behavior. And it's like, what is going on? It's like almost every state all the time. So I think there are good men in all parts of society. That I know to be true. There are good black men in all parts of society. What isn't there is that whenever we show men, whether particularly black men, we show their negative aspects, or we have one black person representing. You heard Juno every time she was speaking about her trans experience. She had to keep saying, "I am not speaking on behalf of all." Yeah, and that's what we have in the situation of the black male, is that a black male comes to prominence, he now becomes, so Barack Obama is now our mascot for black maleness. But he's not the only version of black maleness. There are many versions. Or if it's not that, we have the other extreme, which is the negative hip-hop experience. And it's like, I can only either be Mr. Barack Obama or I'm a waste of space kind of, And I think what we need to see is many representations of manhood from many ethnicities as possible, because we're even just looking at it through color, we're polarizing it. And then what that does, it brings in other aspects that don't allow me or you to exhibit our true maleness. Because what we have now as maleness is not maleness. It is a construct that is damaging, as we can see, it's damaging society. So you get as I'm just going to say, a Harvey Weinstein mentality has been in the film industry. He wasn't the first, yeah, but he was getting away with it for many years, and so were people after. And until you change the mindset, the thought behind the actions will keep perpetuating themselves.
Okay.
Hi, thanks very much for the reading. I found it really moving. Just to tag on, we were talking briefly outside, and I was wondering, choosing poetry as a vehicle for these stories, do you think they would have come across very differently if you'd chosen, say, prose, short stories, or novels?
Yeah, I think they would. I think these are like cappuccino shots. Like they're a lot stronger for some reason. I think what I didn't show to you about that night is that I cried when I read the book, because it was the first time I read it as a reader, and I get my shame. So she's coming up, but it moved me, you know. So I think it could have been a novel, it could have been a film, but I'm a poet through and through. It leaks through my bones. You know, even if I go into other genres, even as I'm writing the play, I still have to write poems. Like that poem, "Bird in Flames," it was actually in the play, and my director said no, and I was like, right, then that's going straight into the book. So I definitely feel I could tell the story in other genres, but I, at my core, am a poet, and I identify as such.
Yeah, I thought they were very powerful. I thought they had that, like you said, cappuccino shots, and they left kind of room for the imagination, and I think that is the power of literature. It needs to allow readers also to their imagination to take flight and to imagine different worlds, different ways of being, how things can be differently. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
As young lady here.
Hi. You said that you were writing knowing that it was with a Western audience in mind. I went to school in Mombasa, Kenya, and in school we read a lot of classic British literature, and this was like, there was no question if we could relate to it. It was just sort of force-fed to us, and that was called, that's literature, you know, the classics. And I'm thinking, do you think that in the Western world, or in Western schools, for example, poetry like yours should be taught to the students? Because I feel like I came to Europe and I was speaking about Shakespeare and Jane Austen, but nobody knew who, for example, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is. Nobody even thought about that who went to school in Britain, for example, but I knew about their writers. So do you think that your poetry should also be taught in British schools, for example, and in Ugandan schools?
Did you hear what she said? I totally agree. Mm-hmm. I'll say yeah. Well, the obvious answer, I mean, you're intelligent. I'll say yes, but for many reasons, it's that what's happening. Literature is the most useful and powerful tool in any culture. You take away the literature from a people, they have nothing. Languages are being lost by the day, and as you lose the language, you lose the people, you lose their story, you lose their voice, you know. And as I was talking to the lady, you know, just now, when that happens, women are always the first to feel the brunt of that, you know. So for me, these stories have to be told. You know, I mean, you know. When we're talking about Mary Magdalene's story, and that she came to, you know, that story is a supposedly story, but we know that Jesus existed. But we question if this story happened. So women are quickly erased from history. You know, languages are quickly erased from history. Other canons are erased from history, and when we do that, this is the world that we have. So the world that we have is the world that we deserve, because we're not preserving the things that matter, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So, yes, I'll just take a question over there.
Hi there. Just more of a technical question, actually, because I noticed one of your poems had a very strong rhyme scheme and the rest were more free-flowing. So I was just wondering how you decide when you sit down with an idea what kind of poem it's going to be, like in terms of the structure and the shape and the rhyme scheme and the meter and things like that.
With a lot of pain. No, I used to love rhyming when I first started, because, when I was naive to think that poems should rhyme, but poem is just, a poem rhyming is one of the tools. It's like seasoning. And I think the bad thing about it is that people overuse rhyme, so it's heavily, a lot of poets are heavily seasoned with rhyme, and they rhyme badly. And I was one of those poets. I had some skill, but in general, I rhyme badly. So I use rhyme sparingly, and so that when I do use it, it's effective. The first poem I actually read to you, if you get the card, that's a sonnet. It rhymes. It rhymes both at the end and internally. And it took me a while to get that competent. And then this other one, it was kind of like, it was almost like a hip hop beat, but I was trying to make it, because what I realized is that it's a way of translation. So rhyme is a coding device. It's a way of making people remember things, so I want you to remember the boy, because the boy soldier is forgotten. So rather than saying to you, I want you to remember the boy, I put it into rhyme, and then you remember the boy,
Rachel?
Thanks. Is it working? No, it's not. Oh, it is working. Nick, one of the comments you made during your talk and your reading was when you're in Uganda, you don't feel Ugandan enough, and when you're in Britain, you don't feel British enough, this identity. And you also talked about language, and I wondered why you hadn't learnt your other mother tongue again. Language is obviously, it's critical to you, it's what you do, and language is so important for identity, and I wondered if you'd thought about learning your language again in order to feel a little bit closer to that Ugandan identity.
I will. There are three languages. So there's Samia, Swahili, and Buganda.
Okay, three languages then. Maybe that's one.
Swahili, yeah. So I will learn them again. I want to learn them with my family, but I will definitely learn them again, and I will spend time doing that. What I would ultimately like to do is just not only learn them, but also to get my books. Well, one of the languages you can't translate, so this is one of the problems we had. I had to translate it into, like Samia, you can't translate my poem into Samia, it had to be translated to another language. But
why not?
Because it's a language that's just spoken. They don't readily write it down. So, and even that highlighted something for me. So I was like, man, maybe I should try and learn and remember it, because this is how languages die, and it's not just people not speaking them, it's people not speaking them because of their shame. So I'm a culprit in that. So I'll definitely be working on that. Thank you for my New Year's resolution. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Should we take a couple more questions? Yes, lady over there.
Hi. I don't know if it's working. Oh, yes, no, it is. Thank you so much for the reading. I've been thinking a lot today we've been talking a lot today about the power of narrative to change people and to change things and to create empathy. We've talked also about some of the issues surrounding categorization, whether that's categorization of gender or what you're talking about, national categorization, not being quite Ugandan, right? And I work with a literary magazine called Sand Journal here in Bayreuth. We publish in English, and one of our goals is to get more stories, exactly what you've been talking about, more perspectives. And we openly call for LGBTQ writers, women writers, and writers of color, and people from outside the metropolitan, outside of the Western world. And one of the questions we kind of grapple with is how do we kind of deal with the problems that surround categorization, because categorization can become tokenism. How do we kind of deal with that in publication? So how do publishers get those stories out there without reverting to stereotyping or categorization, I guess? If you could comment on that.
Well, I don't know if this is the answer to your question, but I hope it helps, is that one of the things I had to unhinge myself from is categorization. So if I did, if I stayed in my category, I should not write about Uganda. You know, I should not even be a writer. I should even be on the stage, because that's what the norm is. So what you have to do in order to bypass that is stop thinking that is the rule book. You know, so your mission statement is, I want other stories. So then the thing then is to set up spaces where you can either hear other stories, get people to want to share their stories, get writers to record those stories and have dialogue, then get the stories out. Because as that happens, then somebody's going to think, I'm a writer, maybe I could write about this, maybe I could talk about this. You know, and it gives confidence and possibility a chance. So what's happening is that, you know, I did some workshops in Uganda, and what I noticed is they were struggling with the same things I've been struggling with are the same things that they're struggling with. That crisis of confidence, that crisis of shame, that crisis of, you know, I know about Shakespeare, just like what you're saying, I know about Shakespeare, but nobody knows about my village and my people. You know, they're suffering the same thing. And all they want is somebody to say, well, go on then. You know, and sometimes that needs to be yourself, but if you have no parameters and you're living in the blocks of, well, I'm from the continent, nobody's going to want my work, then you're living in the trap. You know, the thing is to improve on craft, or to set up spaces for writing and allow people to write. I mean, that's pretty much what I know Bernadine does, not just for myself, but for other writers. She's always setting up spaces for either dialogue. So tell me, why do you not have black writers writing or being published? Let's have a dialogue about it. Let's talk about it. Because then you put it into question. Then she'll set up a space, right? Writers, here you are. Here's an opportunity. Write. And then it's on the onus of the people and their stories. If you want your stories told, there is a platform. You know, we can't keep expecting that somebody will, I mean, we're grateful for people like Bernadine, but we also need to be the people to kind of take that initiative on. So it's kind of something I've learned from Bernadine, is whenever I can set up an opportunity for other writers to write or to be mentored or to something, I'm going to be like, yeah, let's do it, because, you know, somebody did it for me, I'm going to pass it on. And if we keep setting up that habit, it becomes the norm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just one more question. Yeah, this lady there.
Hi. I absolutely enjoy the Ugandan perspective that you've brought, but I'm going to go against the grain in asking this next question. You said that you had shame in writing about the Ugandan experience because you weren't feeling Ugandan enough or British enough, and I understand where you come from. I'm curious about the stories you were writing before you allowed yourself to write the Ugandan stories. What were those stories about? Were they about Britain? Were they about being different in Britain? Or, I mean, do you ever think about those stories?
Oh yeah, I mean, so basically, I mean, if you're coming to my workshop tomorrow, we'll kind of talk about some of those things. But basically, I'm a Ugandan and I'm British, so I have, you know, we talk about this thing about, so I'm in a liminal space. I'm between worlds, yeah, and so when I was in England, I was trying to fit in. You know, when you feel you're from one place but you're living in another, that kind of exilic existence, you're always trying to fit in. And I could see in my poems that's what they were trying to do. But, you know, it's almost like the reason why I wrote Kingdom of Gravity is because there were stories behind those stories. So it's not that I've stopped writing the contemporary story. It's that what is beneath those stories? It's this story. And then of course I will go back to other contemporary experiences.
What was the subject matter, though, of those poems?
You know, it's different stuff. Like, so, you know, I love basketball. There were basketball poems. There was my fatherhood poems. There were poems of my childhood. Some of these terminal poems are part of that contemporary experience. Because one of the things Bill Herbert talks about is that we're constantly in translation. So even though I've lost my language, even though we're speaking the same language now, I'm translating myself. My thoughts in my head are trying to give you an understanding of who I am, and you likewise, in asking your question, are trying to give me an understanding of who you are. So we're constantly in translation. So when I was writing this book, my shame was kind of stupid in a way, because it doesn't matter what I do, I'm always in translation. So I'm trying to translate my culture to your culture, just as I do when I'm speaking. And when I had that epiphany, I lost my shame, and I became more comfortable about talking about my past and also my contemporary present, you know?
So I'm just going to ask one final question. Can you tell us more about the fact that you studied biochemistry at university and then went into banking?
Well, going back to being a black man, and an African black man at that, my parents wanted me to prosper in the West. You know, they came over, and then I came over. I was born in Uganda, they were born in Uganda, and they wanted me to have a good life. I was a smart child. My mom wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer. I didn't get the grades to be a doctor outright, so I got in through clearing through biochemistry, did my biochemistry degree, and I remember sitting there thinking, I don't want to smell of formaldehyde for the rest of my life. You know, and so I still wanted to please my mom and also to do the right thing, so I got into banking. That's another good profession. And then I was like, I don't want to be just counting money for the rest of my life. And I say this jokingly, but Kerry's talked about it. I want to make a difference in the world. I don't want to be an excuse. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be a statistic. I want my life to be spent. So when if I die at whatever age, 90, whatever, at 90 years old, I'm like, phew, you need to die, man. You must be tired, you know. So, and I don't think I would have achieved that being a biochemist or being a banker. I could have made loads of money, but I'd be dead inside, and that would kill me, you know. So that was the transition.
Okay, and are you working on a new sequence of poems?
I have a new sequence of poems, but right now the priority is the play, and also there's a potential of a novel. But those are a novel, yeah.
Okay.
So we'll talk.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. So please let's congratulate Nick on his wonderful.